Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Our Children Can't Wait webinar series. My name is Caitlin McAloon, and I'm the Digital Communications Coordinator at CTS. Today, speakers will be discussing racial justice, youth incarceration, and community accountability. This is the fourth webinar in the series. The webinar will be recording and we'll be sharing follow-up materials. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. At this time, I'd like to introduce our executive director and the author and editor of Our Children Can't Wait, Dr. Joe Bishop.
Thank you, Caitlin McAloon, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it is officially good afternoon on the West Coast. So as Caitlin said, this is our fourth webinar, which is hard to believe. Our Children Can't Wait, the urgency of reinventing education policy in America. And that is the name of our book, everybody on this call right now, the star-studded cast of speakers you see before you. It's a book from Teachers College Press, and it can be purchased on not only from Teachers College Press's website, but also on Amazon. And I'm the lead author lead author and editor for the book. Also the host of Our Children Can't Wait, which is a podcast. And actually, a new episode just dropped today for Our Children Can't Wait. We talked about school funding with Oscar Jimenez Castellanos of Ed Trust and Daniel Ferry from Ed Law Center in New Jersey. So I encourage you to check it out, follow the podcast. Actually, Sonya and Anna, who you're going to hear more from today, were featured in a previous episode. In a future episode, in a few weeks, you're going to hear from Professor Justin Coles. So stay tuned. Again, follow that podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can do that right now on your phone. But let's get to today's conversation. Let's go to the next slide, please, Caitlin. Thanks, Tiana. Okay, so we have a star-studded cast, like I said before. I am incredibly honored to be with us, Dr. Sonya Douglas. Sonya is a professor at Teachers College. She's also the faculty director of the Black Education Research Collaborative Center, not collaborative, and also Anna Kushner. And Anna and Sonya are the co-authors for chapter 4 of the book, For Our Children Can't Wait. Sonya and Anna are going to explore deeper questions today around whose vision of policy and racial equity, and for whom as we move forward as a country. After them, you're going to hear from Dr. Justin Coles, Dr. Keisha Green, Dr. Jamila Lyiscott of UMass Amherst. They're also the faculty directors of the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engagement. And they're going to summarize their chapter for us today, chapter 13 on race-centered, youth-driven policy. And last but not least, Dr. Angela James, who's politely waiting on the Zoom call over here. Dr. James is going to cast a new vision for shifting away from a system that incarcerates thousands of young people every day. And she's the author of chapter 14 of the book. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So the main ideas behind our book are really threefold. If you haven't been on other webinars or tuned into the podcast or had time to read the book. So the three main ideas are: one, we need a new conception of education policy for our country. The ecosystem outside of schools is central to education policy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Like housing, the environment, health, and community safety. And then in-school and out-of-school factors must be prioritized simultaneously. And you can see on the screen right here, here's a visual summary of all the chapters of the book. Number two, racism is the main driver behind policies that have codified an unequal playing field for students and families of color for far too many generations. And number three, the idea that we are all policymakers. Justin, Keisha, and Jamila are going to get into this a little bit more, but we are all policymakers, but we need to find new ways of doing policy that put young people, families, even educators and community members in the driver's seat of their own destiny. So that's the three main points of the book in a nutshell. Next slide, please. So let's get to the who and for whom conversation with Professor Douglas and Anna Kushner. Take it away, Dr. Douglas.
Thank you, Dr. Bishop. And it's great to see all of the contributing authors and those who have helped make this project possible, which is extremely important given what we are currently facing in the education research, policy, and leadership space. I also want to just recognize the work of the UCLA Center for Transformation, again, in helping to bring us together and find ways that we can really advance true social justice and change through education and thinking about it differently. I'm excited to present the chapter that was co-authored by me and Anna Kushner, who is a doctoral student at Teachers College, and we have really been interested in better understanding how organizations are conceptualizing racial equity and what that means. And the title of our chapter, Whose Vision of Racial Equity? Reinventing Education Policy in Post-Civil Rights America, really aims to take a broad brush at looking at some of the larger challenges facing education policy. Again, depending on the perspectives and the experiences that we are centering this conversation around. And so in this chapter, we really looked at two large questions. One, what assumptions and ideologies support education policies focus on diversity and integration, and to what end? And two, how might schools and districts serve as levers for community empowerment, civic participation, and social change? And so some of the broad-reaching or the far-reaching questions that we ask center around the conception of education as the great equalizer in the United States, despite definitions of equality and fairness really mutating in many ways. Despite over 60 years of legislation to make the education system more just, discussions of race, racism, and even educational equity are increasingly controversial. And so we see, again, a lot of activism happening at the local district level in state houses that are really going to determine the extent to which we can teach an accurate accounting of American history and to be able to teach the truth. And so the increasing significance of education policy and its role is something that we look at this chapter. We're also exploring the controversy over critical race theory, again, as a central issue at the nexus of race and education, which through the work of critical perspectives reveal the deep-seated nature of systemic racism and discrimination that often manifests in educational policies. So we then wonder, what role can educational research play really in thinking about how we are conceptualizing a vision of racial equity and to what end? And so one of the tools that we have chosen to pick up was critical policy analysis, which is a useful research tool to help us establish a viewpoint from which to see concerns about equity from those who are most affected by the issues that we're exploring. And so in this instance, we think it's important and critical to center the perspectives of individuals, students, and communities of color when we are looking at issues of racial equity and justice. And so despite both the history of equality-oriented policies and partisan calls to transform education, equity remains a central concern, and its conflation with anti-Americanism and anti-whiteness, I think also underscores the significance and the accuracy of the propositions that critical race theory puts forth. So one of the things that we look at again in thinking about how we can begin to transform the work around racial equity, especially contextualized by the quadruple pandemics as we describe them, from the economic recession through climate change, through obviously COVID and anti-Black violence. We are increasingly looking at ways that we can provide more robust strategies to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that by doing this and using critical policy analysis as a set of tools to, one, really combat the traditional approaches of policy analysis, which are linear and rational, and recognizing in this current moment that rationality is certainly not the driver of education policy, but rather ideologies and politics. And also recognizing that we must center the perspectives of the marginalized and those who typically are not included in policy discussions to better understand the challenges that we're trying to address through racial equity, to really critique, one, to think about and look at education policy as political spectacle. Again, the power of persuasion of symbols and rhetoric that have been really effective at the fight against teaching the truth in education. And also recognizing, and I think this is taken up in Justin Cole's chapter with his colleagues, the fact that we must hold those in power accountable, but also recognizing that we hold the power. And so how do we use our power as community members, as educators, as researchers, scholars, and activists to ensure that the tools that we're using supports evidence-based policies and practices that can translate into real change in schools and districts. With that, I actually want to invite Anna to talk a little bit more about the chapter, and more specifically a study that we have commissioned and that she led through the Black Education Research Center around organizing for racial equity. Again, wanting to better understand who is doing this work, how is racial equity being conceptualized, and how can this work really result in meaningful change in education policy at the local, state, and federal level.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. Hi, everyone. My name's Anna Kushner, and I'm a doctoral student at TC who has the privilege of working with Dr. Douglas. So coming out of this study that really grounds itself, as Dr. Douglas has said, in questions of who is creating a vision of racial equity that we're working towards. We've commissioned a study that we're calling Organizing for Racial Equity that explicitly interviews and talks with community members who are working together in different organizations or as individual organizers working towards visions of racial equity. And this study, the purpose of it is to really get at who is doing this so-called racial equity work, what are they doing and why? And this, going back to the idea of like building an evidence-based future grounded in equity, we're really hoping with this project to center community voice and center the people with lived experience to hear what their visions of racial equity are. So before we even start dreaming from our tower in the academy, we're going and having conversations to hear like, what does racial equity look like here in our community in New York City? Who's working towards it, and what supports that they may want or need or explicitly don't want from a university partnership with folks who want to like contribute and support the work. So by building this evidence-based rooted in community voice and a definition of equity rooted in community visions and care, we're able to center those who are most affected while we're formulating our vision. Which really gets at this question of whose vision are we working towards? And we are so excited to see where it goes. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Dr. Douglas. So now we're going to make a pivot from thinking about a totally different type of vision, and Dr. Douglas talked about critical policy analysis, and also the idea of kind of redefining community and who's really looking behind the curtain, who's there or who should be there, right? And also in this hyper political, ideological world that we're living in and trying to shape schools and the experiences of young people. So we're gonna make that pivot to young people specifically. And Professors Coles, Green, and Lyiscott are gonna walk us through a new framework they have. And I think their work as a collective is really powerful as a model of not only leadership, but also working shoulder to shoulder with young people to do research in new and powerful ways. Take it away, Professor Coles.
Great. Hello, everyone. And we have some slides, and so I guess I'll just sort of make a note when we are ready to go to the next one, but we can stay here for now. Again, hello to everyone who showed up with us today. The three of us are feeling really good today to be in community with you all as we share our collective and ongoing work coming out of our Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research at UMass Amherst's College of Education. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Justin Coles, and I'm an assistant professor of social justice education and director of arts, culture, and political engagement at our center. And I'm joined by my two dynamic co-authors and founding directors of the center, Drs. Keisha Green and Jamila Lyiscott. And so we'll just take a moment to really journey through our chapter in Our Children Can't Wait, which is sort of really focused on youth wilding and sort of reshaping policy. So as youth workers grounded in social justice orientations, we enter our chapter and really broader discussions of policy, believing the key to unlocking racial justice and disrupting racially harmful schooling processes is to be attuned to what youth have to say and what they do, especially in moments where gross violence is enacted against their sort of psychic and material selves. And so we come to our work today thinking about the shooting of Ralph Paul Yarl in Missouri, and the public murder of Jordan Neely on a New York City subway. We are also thinking of the many Black girls and femmes who experience violence, whose stories may be invisibilized in a heteropatriarchal society. And so the impetus for our chapter then can be described as emerging from our acknowledgement of the ways we continually witness and experience the dehumanization of Black and other youth of color in the US society, and how they are often positioned as responsible for the ways they suffer, right? Which leads to policies being created that further marginalize, punish, discredit, harm, et cetera, and et cetera. And we can go to the next slide.
I want to transport us all to spring 2015 to Baltimore, Maryland, in the wake of the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray. Amid protests, crowds of Black people were routinely labeled as thugs by the media. In response to this coverage, one Black youth at a protest in Baltimore was photographed with a sign that reads, "Black youth are not thugs." Through our theoretical networking of critical race counter stories and racial justice informed policymaking, we conceptualize such languaging, Black youth are not thugs, as a policy counter story. Building with our colleagues in youth studies who note that the way society treats youth is an indicator of quality of life, we know that if we continue on this trajectory, that if we continue to treat youth badly, we will see increasing disparities and despairs that limit present and future possibilities towards justice. Next slide, please.
In our work, and again, in this chapter, really sort of our ongoing policy work, we ask two key questions. The first one is, how can the lives of youth of color be leveraged in humanizing ways to restructure US schooling? And second, how might education policy be more racially just if we conceptualized it through the intricate everydayness of youth life? And really something that we always say to ourselves and here is with youth, right? And not just for youth. And so to answer those two questions, which really set the foundation for the development of our racial justice youth policy model, which we'll share in a bit, we utilized the concept and framings of youthtopias, right? As sort of a critical youth studies project concept. And utopias have sort of four key ideals that I'll just name for us all. Understanding the ways race intersects with other identity markers, challenging dominant discourses that seek to explain the experiences of racially minoritized youth, positioning youth experiences as foundational in the construction of educational environments with adults, and then lastly, developing critical consciousness and being committed to social justice. And we're ready for the next slide.
So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and the term Wildin that we use to frame this piece is very a natural term in my coming up. And so in the late 80s and early 1990s, the term Wildin, it took the media by storm. It's a term from colloquial Black youth language practices that was then appropriated by the media to describe packs of Black and brown youth terrorizing people in public spaces, often ending in violence. This concept picked up a lot of traction in the wake of the Central Park jogger case that resulted in 5 innocent Black and brown youth being sent to prison for many years. Tons of policies were created that worked to police youth in the wake of this, a major legacy of this being stop and frisk policing that most of us are familiar with. Policymakers did not consider creating policy with youth, but rather it furthered the dehumanization of youth by enacting policies that would only further violence against them, which it did and continues to do. We reclaim the word wildin, referred to in this chapter not as wilding, as it was incorrectly appropriated by the media, but wildin, to highlight racially minoritized young people's performance of wilderness as resistance and disruption against racialized discourses and policies designed without youth input. In our chapter, we offer our reclamation of Wildin as an embodiment of our theorization of a policy counterstory. To enact Wildin in a youth policy sense is to advance a different story that runs counter to dominant narratives of policy that work to shape youth life. Thus, to engage in Wildin as a policy aim is to insert one's voice into the fabric of traditional policy discourse, to restructure and shape justice-driven educational futures. Through this lens of policy counterstoring, we insist on youth culture, voice, activism, and leadership as central to the new conceptions of education policy, both in terms of goals and process. Next slide, please.
So quickly to think about a little bit more how we got here. So to re-engage in policy through a lens of Wildin and policy counter stories, we explore the lines of youth-centered research and praxis that have shaped our own individual scholar activism. And so very briefly, Keisha will share on her double Dutch methodology. I'll discuss Black story work, and then Jamila will just quickly detail liberation literacy's pedagogy.
Thank you. So what I'm calling double Dutch methodology, or DDM, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to a range of methodological strategies that help us to humanize this work that we do with young people. That's participatory, reflexive, and grounded in our lived experiences. So double Dutch methodology, it's a way of reconceptualizing participant observation, or we can think of it as an alternative way of thinking about qualitative research with youth, or youth processing, as we are naming in this chapter. And through DDM, youth policy can be conceptualized as a set of practices or protocols for youth work, youth leadership, or knowledge development that is to be fluid, participatory, grounded in cultural or heritage practices, and strength-based, textured, contextual, and inviting and welcoming, and not only welcoming, but centering the lived and living experiences of our young people.
Black story work, which is rooted in the Black oral tradition, is an educational method and practice that is wholly about capturing how Black youth are critical to their societal and academic experiences, guided by their sense-making of the world through their unique social lenses, and centered on collective dialogue, a tapestry of youth storytelling. Black story work really just creates the time and environs necessary for Black youth to tell the counter stories, right here, or policy counter stories of how various schooling structures and processes advance their overall wellness and academic success, or how they cause harm and hinder that success.
Liberation literacy's pedagogy posits that since language is ideologically, historically, and politically saturated, attempts to disconnect Black and Brown youth from the languages of their communities through schooling are grounded in racialized colonial logics. Framed by 5 paradigm principles: awareness, agency, action, and achievement and alteration, liberation literacy's pedagogy creates avenues for policy counterstories as youth of color draw on their rich linguistic repertoires to author policy change in ways that are grounded in their youth voices and being. Next slide, please.
So central to what we're foregrounding as our vision of youth policy are 3 core elements. And we mentioned this throughout the chapter, and we have these nice visuals. These 3 core elements are youth processing, youth criticality and sense-making, and then youth being and voice. And so at CRJ and our racial justice youth policy model, which parenthetically, it's informed by each of our respective research areas, as you've heard, the double Dutch methodology, the Black story work, and liberation literacy's pedagogy. So we spotlight the aforementioned core elements across 5, what we're calling 5 areas of influence that come to make up our racial justice youth policy model. So these areas are racial equity, and you'll see here for racial equity, we attend to mapping diasporic identities and youth solidarities as a way to interrogate and collaboratively dismantle systems of oppression that impact our communities while also engaging in freedom dreaming and world building practices. Also in critical teacher education, we're always centering youth. In fact, tomorrow night, we're having a youth-led teach-in for local educators. So youth are informed theorizers of teaching, and they're theorizing, teaching, and learning. We also emphasize youth leadership, centering the interests and needs of youth of color, really shaping how and what we do. Also fugitivity and abolition, and this is where we're thinking a lot about youth agency and collective action and what that looks like, right? It may not look like what we do as adults or older folk. And then also at the core is community engagement. So always drawing from the indigenous knowledges or local knowledges of youth and communities of color to better understand social issues. Next slide.
And thank you all for giving us the space. And just as we end, I just want to say all too often when youth are invited into policy conversations, or rather policy is enacted against them, it's typically in sort of symbolic or tokenized ways. And when youth are invited, it typically is about them pouring out their trauma, right? And these sort of pain narratives in order to enact change. Our racial justice policy model calls for meaningfully engaging the local knowledges of youth of color in ways, again, that really move beyond those sort of surface symbolic gestures. It directly calls for state and federal bodies to create legislative pathways that address significant challenges in the lives of youth of color that do not replicate damage-centered policies, shout out to Eve Tuck, right, such as the war on drugs, for example, but that rely on the power of youth processing, youth criticality, and youth voice to design social futures that really get us to build the capacity for developing and sustaining their agency and success. And so that is it, and we thank you all.
So Professors Coles, Lyiscott, and Green, I just want to thank you for pushing us in the short time we have together. And Professor Coles, I want to go back to something he said before we go to Dr. James. And something you and I have talked about a little bit more, but the power of art as a policy-making process. Could you say a little bit more about that and how it relates to the work of your center?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that we are, I don't know, will we say unofficially or officially? I'd say we're like officially sort of an arts-driven center. But I think just for a quick response, we know that people communicate in multiple ways, and the three of us are actually like literacy folks because we understand the power of multiple literacies and that communication is beyond just like one language, particularly when we think about like the sort of mono style of the US and English being it. We know that people's embodied experiences often can't only be told through language, particularly because we often silence youth language, particularly the language of Black and Brown folks. But we know that art is something that is sort of universal. And so we think about the ways youth can document their lives and their future possibilities through art, and how people are forced, right, to see it, right? You're forced to reckon with it because you can't silence it in the ways that you might silence youth voice, and art takes up space. And so we believe that youth have the right to take up space. And you know, we often think about youth as sort of being future adults and then being future citizens, but we understand they are citizens now. Yeah. And so how do we get them to document that so that we might sit with it?
Thank you. Yeah, and there's much more we could say about that, Justin, but I want to thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And I see that we have some conversations already starting. Marty Estrada provide the information for Dr. James to answer your questions specifically around suspensions. So thank you for posting those questions. And we will have a copy. This recording will go out as a follow-up email to everybody registered. So along with the slide deck. But let's go to Dr. James, who I would say you all weren't in the same room, but you are pursuing the Youth Wildin counter story through your chapter. Unintentionally, but we could say it was all intentional. So Dr. James, take it away.
Thank you for that. I hope to someday be in the same room with this group. I'm just captured by the stories and the work that you all are doing. I feel, you know, I started before hearing you guys feeling very heavy. In fact, the news here in Los Angeles has been every other day, at least, something has appeared about juvenile justice centers and facilities and the harms that children have and are suffering in those facilities. Just this very week, a child died in custody of an overdose. And I learned from the LA Times that in fact, there had been at least 3 others in the last couple of months, not resulting in death. So I feel heavy. Those are stories that, you know, weigh you down. And there are other stories of the use of chemicals on children in juvenile justice facilities and extreme force being used on children in juvenile justice facilities. They are weighty, weighty stories. And so with all that's going on, I have often been asked, well, why are you focused on education? Why is this question of all the questions concerning young people who are incarcerated, why education? And to that I say, the title of this book couldn't be better. Our children simply cannot wait is the answer. And you know, we can advance the slide right quick. I lose track of all of these things. The children who are in juvenile justice facilities are often children who have long been underserved by educational institutions. The sum total of zero tolerance policies, school suspensions, the criminalization of youth, some of the things that are, you know, my co-presenters have discussed in their presentations, all of these things are what kind of lead young people, the push outs and the lack of academic engagement. All of those things are what land young people in these carceral facilities. And yet, despite all of that, where the state has control of their bodies, where they are, these are physically controlled spaces where they are constantly surveilled. It is not officially incarceration, and yet it is incredibly carceral. If you've ever visited one of the spaces, and yet we are there being charged with educating them, because every child is entitled to a public education. Every child, not exempting children in these spaces. So why do we need to focus on education and education policy and juvenile justice? Because as long as there are children who are in that circumstances, they simply cannot wait. They've been asked to wait long enough. To paraphrase Martin Luther King's words from the Birmingham jail, the cup of endurance has run over. We're done waiting. The educational needs of young people in juvenile justice facilities simply must be addressed. So I started the chapter just by doing a kind of overview of who we're talking about. What are the magnitude of youth incarceration? What are changes have been made in the last decade or so? And what are the demographic characteristics? And so looking at that, surely we see a huge change. Prior to 91, if we were to look at the other end of that, this figure, we would see a buildup, an incredible buildup with the war on drugs that was discussed earlier. Huge numbers. And in fact, the United States holds more young people than any other country in the world. And so the kind of punitive response of mass incarceration encompasses the circumstances of young people. So what we see in the last few years, though, looks to be kind of a tidal change, where pretty dramatic reductions in the numbers of young people in residential placement is apparent. And those numbers have become even smaller in wake of the mass pandemic, which, you know, there's a whole other set of concerns around that. Next slide, please. However, the magnitude of changes, the disparate nature of incarceration in these facilities is still apparent. And so if anything, the gaps between whites and in particular, Black young people and Latinx or Hispanic young people have increased. Even though they've dropped in sheer numbers, the gaps have increased. And so we remain concerned about who is there. And I will add, beyond the topic of race, 100% of young people who are, well, I shouldn't say 100%, maybe 99.9 or 99.7 are children from poor families. The wealthy are not here. These are poor kids of whatever race. Next slide, please. Before I get into key concerns, I do want to note that in the research, I was able to find a few bright lights, I shouldn't call them bright lights, even brighter lights, places where there were promising practices in terms of the education and care for young people in these circumstances. And so I looked at the Missouri model, which focused on a whole child, whole system, where the systems were interlocking and the focus was on therapeutic concerns, where large kind of dormitory style facilities were disbanded in lieu of much smaller cottage style places where education actually occurred within those small cottages, which never exceeded about 10 to 15 young people. So that was one system we looked at. We looked at Maya Angelou Academy, which operates in the District of Columbia in their jail facilities. There, young people are educated in very similar manner. I found it very similar to Los Angeles. Kids there sometimes a few days or weeks, other times up to a year or more. The focus in that system, which has won awards and acclaim, is on relationships and really high quality education services. And here in Los Angeles, we looked at the Road to Success Academies, which was focused on project-based learning, is part of what had been called in Los Angeles the Care First model, the LA model. The model itself, incredibly interesting in terms of its project-based focus, which was intended to deeply engage young people in real life kind of ways that move beyond the typical worksheets of Xeroxed papers clipped together and into real projects which would excite them. But in all, there still remain key concerns that I think are important for us to look at. Now, most of us are really very familiar with the clamoring for academic accountability in schools across the country. Most of our schools have some sort of public report cards that are prominently posted. Again, schools in carceral contexts are not exempt from this. And yet, there are real concerns, I think, around record keeping and accountability. Because after all, accountability for schools that operate in such absolutely distinct environments such as these cannot simply follow the model of schools elsewhere. So I detail in the chapter my concerns around record keeping and accountability, but you just can't have a year's, a summary measure of the year as though children have been there the whole school year. That may not be perfectly, it might not perfectly match the circumstances of schools and neighborhoods and communities, but they completely don't match the circumstances of these schools, where some children are there a month and other kids are there more than a year. So the accountability measures need to be distinctly arranged for this circumstance so that there is true accountability. Things like and I highlight this elsewhere. Things like how many days are lost to carceral shutdowns. There's a range of concerns around record keeping and accountability so that we really can be certain that children in these contexts are getting the kind of educational services which they are entitled to and deserve. Staffing, in so much as there are teacher shortages around the country, perhaps there is no place where there are more acute shortages than in juvenile justice context. So teacher shortages, which have wide-ranging implications. I mentioned the Road to Success academies that I looked at here in Los Angeles County, which had a wonderful model, and integral to that model was continued professional development and training. However, if half the teachers at any given time are substitutes, those substitutes are not necessarily getting that kind of ongoing professional development and training. And that has huge implications for the implementation of any model, no matter how laudable. Multi-agency coordination. One of the things that I really like about both the Missouri model and the Maya Angelou Academy was a focus on the necessity of multi-agency coordination and therapeutic focus as well. At the end of the day, these are traumatized young people who have likely experienced trauma before, certainly trauma attended to arrest. And unfortunately, as the Los Angeles Times accounts highlight, have ongoing trauma that they experience as consequence to the circumstance of incarceration. So the importance of multi-agency coordination, mental health, educational services, as well as the carceral structure is incredible, and yet is incredibly uneven in terms of how that is executed across the country and across the state, and certainly even in my own community. The other key concern I wanted to just highlight really quickly is this issue of declining numbers. Often I celebrate declining numbers, and I look forward to the day that all of these facilities are bereft of any young people. Absolutely, this approach to addressing concerns with our young people is incorrect, and I look forward to the day we don't have it. Other countries don't, and we shouldn't. However, declining numbers doesn't mean declining need. And so if there are 10 children in the space, those 10 children have to be educated. And so, and their academic services that may be in fact necessary may exceed a school where there are 30 kids there. So, the declining numbers are concerned because I worry that our continued investment that relies on simple numbers absolutely doesn't serve well the young people in this circumstances. So no matter how many or how few, they are still entitled to a quality education. And so even as we applaud the numbers, we have to redouble our concern about the issues of accountability and staffing that remain important. Next slide, please. I, in the chapter, have a number of recommendations, but the most important recommendation has to be that of developing educational and administrative accountability systems that allow us to, before there's a big lawsuit, assure that the kind of high quality educational services that children are entitled to are received. I cannot emphasize this enough. One of the things that I highlight in the chapter is the large number of students who need and require special educational services that are in these circumstances. And so the entitlement of all young people to high quality educational services and the additional requirement that they be services that actually are mandated in various directions, including those for if they have learning disabilities or other emotional needs. So the development of accountability systems that help us to assure that children are in ongoing fashion getting what they need and that the academic needs are being addressed. But there are also needs that are, that may be better enacted at the local level. And that is those of this kind of professional development, which is targeted for the needs of these children, not, folks that are retired and haven't received, training specific to this at all. When you look across the country, most training programs don't have any specific training around juvenile justice education. And so the specific needs of young people in the circumstances need to be addressed by people that are properly trained to address them. Next slide. I just want to open up the conversation about juvenile justice education and the concerns of educators. Education should properly be the focus of young people at this stage of life as we seek to prepare them to enter society and become productive adults. Education, we argue, is the gateway. And yet, too little attention is given to the educational circumstances of young people in carceral contexts. And so, thanks very much. I hope I did not overshoot my time, but I'm happy to take any questions and discuss this further.
So we're going to open it up, and actually, I'm going to thank you, Dr. James. I'm going to pivot back to Dr. Douglas and Anna Kushner. So in Angela's chapter, she talks about we lock up over 40,000 young people and spend $25 million a day to do so. For Sonya and Anna, as you're thinking about what we've heard from these other chapters and going back to your chapter, what insights can you provide about these connections and really for a path forward for our country? Which, Sonya, you laid out the entrenched nature, but also you talk about this has all been by design. We've created this system ourselves that Angela just articulated in very troubling terms. But what are you thinking? I mean, I think my question is what's on your mind right now as you hear all these connections being made?
Well, I mean, I think, and this is nothing new, but I think education requires significant transformation and revolution in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we've been focused on at Burke is what I've described as building a new house. We've all, I think, kind of echoed the sentiment that the system that we currently have is not really designed for what are now the majority of school children. And so rather than trying to, tinker with policy and make changes, whether through programs, direct services, funding certain initiatives, it's really time, I think, and a prime opportunity for us to think about what the purpose and value of education is in this current moment. That is contingent upon the vision of what America wants to be and how it sees itself, and ensuring that the education system that we have, provides a space and generates the types of learners and educators and leaders that will allow us to fulfill that vision of the country. Some of us think it's one that is inclusive, that it reflects a beloved community where we appreciate the cultural differences and experiences that people bring. Others believe that it should be, again, a very narrow, Eurocentric, top-down, structure that continues to lock out and is not relevant to a large number of children. So I think that it requires, again, thinking about policy on the large scale and influencing policy in ways that create the conditions that allow for the type of work that's being discussed. I also think it requires a lot of individual self-reflection. And so one of the things that I'm advancing through my own scholarship is the scale framework for learning and liberation. And that, again, requires us as individuals, as well as the institutions that we serve and lead, to reflect on knowledge of self. So scale stands for self-knowledge, right? So really, again, understanding who you are in the work, and how your own culture and experiences have shaped the way that you engage in this space. C is for culture, really calling for us to engage, I think, in deeper and more nuanced conversations around what culture is, in terms of even, national or ethnic cultures, as well as the culture of an organization, of a school, of a system. A points to agency and the fact that, as this work and a lot of the work that you do at UCLA, and that's actually discussed in this book, is around agency, right? That we all have, despite the significant historical and structural challenges that we face, we still have the power. It's about knowing how we use the power that we do have, right? And activating it. L, speaking to leadership, we need good leadership, and we need to, as a community, determine what the characteristics of a good leader are, and how we prepare individuals to take up the mantle, especially around issues of equity and justice. And then E stands for enduring values. And again, I think it gets to the heart of this work in terms of what we do value, and what we will not negotiate as it relates to education. And I think in this moment, we have to be committed to truth in teaching, whatever that may look like. And, again, I think that we have, through the individuals you've convened for this book, for many of the colleagues and the individuals that we all work with in our own spaces, that we can organize and build a movement to create the type of educational systems that we desire. And so that's what's on my mind, and kind of figuring out, again, how we bring those pieces together. And as I've said before, quit bringing, we can't bring a knife to a gunfight. It's probably a terrible metaphor given, again, the real challenges that schools are facing, but that we have to understand how important the future of education is, and that we actually have a role to play in shaping it.
Thank you, Sonya. Well put. And thinking about, I'm reading the comments. Plessy versus Ferguson is alive and well. Questions about litigation, questions about services. There's a lot to cover in the chat box. I'm not going to cover everything, but what I will say on the topic of agency, or question I have for Justin, Keisha, and Jamila, on the topic of agency in young people, what's one thing that folks can do right now that aligns to these frameworks that you're outlining for us today, to not be overwhelmed by what we're raising, but to feel empowered and liberated to do something different about the world they see? What's the one thing? I know that's incredibly hard, but what do you want folks to take away? Because we're getting close to the top of the hour here.
I'm just going to chime in.
One
to say thanks to Dr. Joe Bishop for inviting us to be a part of the volume. Thanks for holding it down. This has been a great experience to be such a part of all the other contributors, AERA, and the webinars and the podcasts. A lot of times I say things like, hold space, be around young people. I know we don't have much time, so I'll keep it short. A lot of us, we at the center, we deliberately said we cannot be a center that talks about ed research and not have young people be a part of that. And as many of us know, we are in colleges of education all the time and rarely see young people in the hallways or in our classrooms, rarely see young people in our courses, as we're training teachers. And so our commitment to disrupt that be deliberate about having young people be at every stage of the process and listen. So a lot of times I just tell people, if you're not around young people or holding space, whether in and out of schools, right? A lot of our research sites are beyond classrooms or in classrooms, but also outside of classrooms. I know a lot of the work that I've done has been outside of classrooms, working with young people, gathering in ways that, we aren't necessarily honoring as, educational spaces or places where folks are being really productive. So, it sort of seems simple, but really take stock and think about how often am I around young people? How much am I listening? And Dr. Coles mentioned it before. We talk about them in the future, they're developing, they're becoming people who will later contribute. They're contributing now. And in fact, shaping our world so much now more than ever. So I think that that's super important, just, thinking about how much we have young people in our spaces and leading these spaces and really allowing their voices and perspectives to drive what we do.
Thank you, Professor Green. Thank you for your kind words too. Dr. James. So this is hard. I gave you all 10 minutes to summarize a chapter in a book, which is just not fair given what we're talking about. But Dr. James, what's on your mind as you're drawing connections and trying to help folks think about, like, what do I do next from here? And there's a lot of folks who are commenting who work in juvenile settings where young people are detained. Like, what help us, lead us to what do we do? In your chapter gives us lots of recommendations, which you couldn't get in everything, but what do we do?
I can't get in everything. Well, part of what I suggest is that we all raise hell. I mean, we absolutely cannot accept the circumstances that our children are in. We cannot accept the abuses, and we cannot accept the educational neglect, neither that they experience while incarcerated, nor the educational neglect that many of them experienced before, and the educational difficulties that continue. So I think that we have to shine a bright light, and we have to raise the issue everywhere that we can. That is number one. And there really are policies at the federal, state, and local levels. You asked me where my mind is. My mind is on the case of the young person whose story I opened the chapter with. My mind is on Malcolm, who I met as a first grader, as he was a student of my sister, and just bright as can be and charming with a smile that light up the world. But also with a lot of really weighty problems, and who ends up in juvenile facilities, which do not help him to bridge the gap and meet his therapeutic needs to desist from the things that led him there. So my mind is there because, the brilliance of that young person, that's someone I knew. And so I think moving from seeing them as them to seeing them as us, and to understanding children in these contexts as children. They are not little adults. They are still children, most often adolescents. They have developmental needs and additional needs brought on by often a great deal of trauma that we really have to be concerned with. And I think it starts with seeing them as our neighbors, our brothers, our cousins, and our community members who deserve our care and are entitled to that care.
So, Dr. James, them and those to us and ours.
Yes,
that's our charge.
yes.
And let's go to the last slide. I know we're 1 minute over. Okay, so we're gonna send the slide deck out, the recording. It's coming. Hang tight. Please sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already. We're taking a summer break, but we're not going away. We're just giving you a break. Come back on September 12th for our final webinar on the book. Linda Darlingham and Shauna Cook Harvey, Bruce Leslie, Arnold Faggy, Dr. John Jackson. We're kind of tying it all together, tying the series together. listen to the podcast again every Wednesday. Follow the podcast. Find these brilliant people. They're not hard to find. Email them. Please buy the book, and please don't give up. And apparently, go raise hell is our final charge in different ways. And we're all going to do that. But I think our charge, more importantly, is to help give young people the tools and the know-how to know how to make good trouble. And I think that's our bigger charge today. So thank you all so much, and hope you have a great afternoon wherever you are. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.